From FingerLakes1.com, this is Inside the FLX. I'm Josh Durso, and today we're talking about the weather. Not just about the forecast, though, rather the hype around those forecasts. Recently, we've seen more and more of those stories pop up, and to discuss this, plus much more in the weather world, we have Finger Lakes Weather founder and meteorologist Drew Montreuil in studio. Drew, thanks a lot for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Josh. It's great to be here.
So, first off, before we get into any of the real nitty-gritty details, talk to us a little bit about what the evolution of Finger Lakes Weather and how that started and how it's evolved in the last couple of years in particular.
Well, I actually started kind of my online forecasting career way back when I was in high school in 2006. I founded a little website, grotonweather.com. The main motivation behind that was I got sick of everybody asking me if we're going to have a snow day every time there was snow in the forecast. So I was like, I'm just going to put it up online so that everybody can see it there. That quickly evolved into doing daily forecasts. I kept it up through my college days at SUNY Oswego. Founded Finger Lakes Weather, kind of expanded my focus about 5 years ago. And that's really kind of taken off now where I've got zip code forecasts for the Finger Lakes. I'm doing daily blog posts. I'm very interested in getting videos going, a mobile app's hopefully in the works soon. So it's really taken off much more than I ever thought it would. But it's definitely been a great enjoyment and a lot of work, but it's worth it.
I always find the interesting thing is there's more of a demand for it than people realize, I think. Listening to people say, "Oh, what's the weather going to do?" They will gravitate to a site like Finger Lakes Weather just because it's available and because it's hyper local, right?
Yes, definitely. People really appreciate the local approach that I take. Mm-hmm. There's no real big media market right here in the heart of the Finger Lakes. Right. Rochester and Syracuse, kind of on the fringe. Weather here in the central Finger Lakes isn't going to be the same as those areas. And a lot of the national, big companies that do the weather, they're not going to be able to capture the details and the localness of the Finger Lakes and how it impacts our weather. So people really like that hyper-local approach that I take.
So to that end, speak, if you could, to the diversity of what a daily forecast could look like. Whether it's, you go from Wayne County down to Tompkins County and then over to Ontario County, you could have three completely different forecasts, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Most days, just on an average normal day, there's probably like a good 5 to 10 degree temperature range across the Finger Lakes. One of the kind of unique things that I enjoy about the Finger Lakes is it's usually warmer in the north as opposed to the south, which is kind of backwards to how it intuitively would be. And that's just because of how the topography is laid out in our area. But once you start bringing in lake effect snow, completely different forecasts all across the region, any sort of a mixed precipitation event, even within the same zip code, you're going to have snow up in the higher elevations, rain down in the valleys, a whole mix of stuff in between. Mm-hmm. So trying to capture all those little details, it really takes somebody who is here in the Finger Lakes experiencing this on a daily basis, forecasting this on a daily basis, to really be able to start to capture those details.
Now, weather hype. What is it? What does it look like? Some people might be experiencing it on a pretty regular basis, but not actually understand what it is. There was a really good example that popped up from AccuWeather in the last few weeks about the Thanksgiving week in particular. But talk to us a little bit about weather hype and what it is and how it came to be. Why does it exist?
To really understand weather hype, you got to kind of take a step back and understand the forecast process. A big part of forecasting is the computer models that we use that simulate the weather. Most of the operational models will give you a day-to-day look at what they think the weather might be like 10 to 14 days out. So what happens is the further out you get, the less and less reliable these models are, and also the more chaotic they tend to be. So a lot of times in that 10 to 14, 20-day range, the models will fire up these big storms, whether it's, big thunderstorm outbreaks or definitely big snowstorms. And with social media kind of becoming such a huge part of our daily lives, it's very easy for, anywhere from big companies like AccuWeather to small people who don't even have a real background in meteorology to grab onto one or two of those model runs that show this big storm, make some nice fancy graphics, post it up on social media, and it goes crazy. So it's kind of this whole dynamic of these companies want people to visit their sites. Mm-hmm. The way to do that is to get some hype going, get this sensationalized story about this big storm. Everybody freaks out, goes to their website. Advertisers love to see all that traffic, so that's the money that the weather company then gets. So it's kind of this self-feeding monster in a way that really can just, especially now with social media, just go out of control very quickly.
What kind of damage can something like this, AccuWeather or any, especially with the larger media companies, the larger forecasting companies, they grab onto something or they push something out. How much damage can that actually do? Not just in terms of what people think, but also kind of damaging the credibility of every other forecaster out there.
Absolutely. I mean, we've all heard the weatherman jokes plenty before. And,
right.
I still see in comments on different weather posts, I wish I could get paid to be wrong 90% of the time, stuff like that. And this sort of weather hype certainly isn't helping that credibility. When a big national company is blasting about a big storm that's going to impact the majority of the Northeast, which is one of the most populated parts of the country, 2 weeks in advance on one of the biggest travel times of the year, and then nothing happens, that's going to seriously damage the credibility the next time a storm comes. Hurricane Sandy 5 years ago is a great example. The forecasts for Sandy were spot on, like a week out or more. Mm-hmm. But if there's this hype all the time, people are going to stop paying attention to that. When there is a good forecast and the science behind it, they're just going to tune it out because they'll just think, that's not going to happen because the last 18 times they said it didn't happen. So
right. So then I guess the obvious follow-up question to that is how do you fix it? How do you create your own credibility in the industry, in the field? What sort of cues do you take, or what steps do you take to make sure that the people who follow you understand that you're not going to predict a nor'easter 3.5 weeks out?
Well, it's really a delicate balance. It depends on each situation. The first thing to be doing is always, as a forecaster, be looking for these events, a couple weeks out and see how the models handle them. If they show a big storm 2 weeks out, don't say anything yet because there's not really any need to, and it probably won't happen, but keep an eye on it. If it's consistently showing it model run after model run, day after day, that lends a lot more credibility to, this is something that's going to happen. So then you can start kind of gradually getting people into the loop of, looks like an active weather pattern in a week or so. Mm-hmm. And then, there's a chance that this weather pattern could spawn a storm. Don't know where yet, don't know when or what sort of intensity it'll be. And then as you start to get closer, you start kind of gradually sprinkling in more of the details as you start to become more sure of those details. So, mm-hmm. Then the progression goes, there's going to be a storm. Well, we're pretty certain of that. Is it going to go west of the Finger Lakes and bring us warm weather and rain, or is it going to go east and give us cold and snow? We don't know yet. And then as it keeps getting closer and closer, you start nailing down those details more and more. And it's just really about open communication. Mm-hmm. Knowing what you do know and what you don't know, and letting everybody else know that, and not being afraid to say, we don't know what's going to happen yet.
Mm-hmm. Now, as far as the forecasting goes, so basically the way it sounds, you're saying, as you get closer to that 72, 48, 24-hour window, that's when things start to really solidify on what you know and what you don't know for sure. Is that where the cone of certainty is when you're going through a forecasting process, especially for a big weekend or a big week or weekend like a Thanksgiving travel weekend or a 4th of July, whatever the case may be, New Year's, Christmas? Is that when things start to solidify, like 2-3 days beforehand?
A lot of times, yeah, that is kind of the time frame, but it does depend on each situation.
Mm-hmm.
Like I mentioned, Sandy, forecasts 5-7 days out were really pretty much spot on for that storm. There's other times where you get one of these storms coming in where it's like, okay, the temperature's right in that iffy zone where if it's a degree or two colder, it's going to snow, a degree or two warmer, it's going to rain. Sometimes you don't really know what's going to happen until it's happening. We had one of those storms last year where, it just gave me fits trying to forecast it. And, so what I ended up doing is I basically said, okay, everybody, there's kind of two possibilities here. It's either going to rain and not really do much, or if it's a degree or two colder, so just a razor thin line here we're talking about, it's going to end up snowing. And I kind of came down on one side, said, these are the two possibilities. I think this one's going to happen. I ended up being wrong, and it was the other one. But everybody was ready for it anyways. They were prepared for it, and I didn't get any death threats or hate mail or anything. So, even though my actual, I think it's going to rain forecast and it ended up snowing was wrong, the whole thing was a big success because everybody was prepared for either situation.
Our listeners, readers, watchers of your forecast, will they give you less of a hard time about it if you say it's not going to snow and it does, as opposed to being the other way around on it, saying, we're going to get a foot or a foot and a half or 2 feet of snow and only getting, 3, 4, 5 inches?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to say that the people that follow me on Facebook and Twitter and on my website and stuff,
I think they're some of the nicest people.
They really are, because I can totally blow a forecast. It happens once in a while, and
yeah.
They don't get upset. It's nothing like the comment sections you see on other stories or
right.
Facebook feeds and stuff. So, really great people here in the Finger Lakes that follow me. But I feel like most people would rather be prepared for a lot of snow and then not have it not happen, as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to the other way around. I think it's a lot harder to go to bed at night and not expect anything and wake up with 10 inches of snow on your car, as opposed to expecting that and then getting up and, it's only an inch. That's not so
pleasant surprise. So another thing I wanted to get your take on, National Weather Service changed some of their warnings, their warning advisory system. Your thoughts on I believe they branded it a simplification. Mm-hmm. Your thoughts on the changes and what it means for the casual weather watcher who's just sort of, checking the forecast because they're taking off this weekend.
Well, it's such a difficult thing to try to communicate the different severity of these systems, and the Weather Service has done a great job over the last 5 to 10 years, even really taking that to heart and trying to communicate the forecasts better. People still have a real hard time understanding the difference between a watch, a warning, and an advisory. Mm-hmm. Just for reference, advisory means that there's bad weather happening, but as long as you're not, putting yourself in harm's way, you should be okay. Warning means you need to take cover. A watch is kind of the
preliminary.
This could happen, so watch out. But the changes that they're making, I have a few mixed feelings on them. Generally, overall, I think they're a good thing. Mm-hmm. The things they're doing with winter weather advisories and warnings, kind of consolidating them, I can see why they're doing it. Personally, I would like to know if it's going to be freezing rain or snow just from the name of the advisory.
Right.
They used to have winter weather advisories and freezing rain advisories. Now they're kind of lumped in together. But it's right there in the text, very easy to see in bullet form, hazard, freezing rain. So it's not a huge deal, I don't think. I believe the Weather Service is going to start looking at the flood advisories and warnings next come springtime, which I'm really excited about because there's currently like river flood and aerial flood and flash flood. So it can be really confusing. People are like, well, what's an aerial flood advisory? So that's going to be a real good simplification. But it's just real encouraging to see them taking all these things to heart and always constantly trying to improve their service and the communication of their forecasts. I've got a tremendous respect for the Weather Service and think they do a great job with what they do.
Now, it sounds like you are comfortable with the separation and sort of removal of lake effect snow advisory, lake effect snow warning, and just lumping that into the winter storm warning. Could that possibly take people off guard, so to speak, about lake effects? Because lake effect can be wildly different than a traditional just, general snowfall.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how people react to it. The people around here that are used to lake effect, they know that it's hyper-localized. They know that you could be driving down the street and it'll be sunny, and then all of a sudden it'll be a whiteout, and then it'll be sunny again. So it's probably there's going to be an adjustment period, I'm sure, with people trying to figure that out. But I think if people take the time and try to look just a little bit deeper in beyond just the headline of the alert, that it's going to be very clear what people should expect, probably even a bit more clear than it was before.
Now, last winter, I believe it was, where we had pretty much just two major winter weather events here in the Finger Lakes. And then this past summer, some really prolific flooding in Cayuga County, in southern Cayuga County. These sort of extreme weather events, or I'll call them oddball weather events, seems like they're happening more frequently. Do you subscribe to that logic, or do you think it's just kind of a law of averages where you're going to get so many freak events annually or every couple of years? I
do think that it's partly just kind of a law of averages. If you look back through our climate history, especially with flooding, it's been there. There's been lots of big flood events that come out of nowhere. It's not that hard to find those in the events. We've always got a lot of snow, big snowstorms. 1966 sticks out in my mind as one that's back quite a ways. But I think social media, again, has kind of added a whole new layer onto this, where people have more access now to the forecasts, but also the aftermath and the reports of what happens. 50 years ago, if there was big flooding in Moravia, like there was this summer, up here in Seneca Falls, probably won't hear too much about it. As opposed to now, everybody's seeing the pictures, they see the videos of the water rushing down the road and washing it away. So it becomes a lot more real to people that, these things are happening, and they become a lot more aware to it. So I think that is definitely kind of an added layer to all of it.
Now, yesterday I had Cayuga County Legislature Chair in studio, and we were talking about that prolific weather event that happened, I believe it was just before July 4th, that first week of July. Yep. What was it like covering that weather event? And I guess I'm kind of curious what the comparison would be to like a large winter storm where you do have at least a couple, 3-4 days to kind of mentally prepare for covering that kind of duration event, where this just seemed to come almost out of nowhere.
Yeah, it definitely, flash flooding is a very unique thing to try to forecast. You can kind of tell that the situation is going to be there, especially if you've had lots of heavy rain for the past couple months. You see the atmosphere is just loaded with moisture. You know that the winds aren't real strong, so the storms aren't going to be moving real fast, but you don't know where it's going to happen. You don't know where that storm's going to pop up and sit and dump 5 inches. So it can be real hard to communicate that sort of a threat when you know that it's only going to be a very small portion of your viewers that actually have to deal with that threat. So trying to communicate that is definitely very difficult. Whereas, in a snowstorm, it's going to get pretty much the whole area to some degree or another. And you do know it's coming, you know about where it's going to be. So in some aspects, that is a lot easier. And the same sort of thing can be said about severe thunderstorms. There's going to be severe thunderstorms, especially if there's a tornado threat. You can have a pretty good sense that, there might be 1 or 2 tornadoes, but trying to pinpoint where that might be is pretty much impossible.
Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, I have to ask, what does obviously several days out, what does that Thanksgiving week look like compared to what some of the, we'll call it hyped out forecasts were a few weeks ago? Does it look similar? Does it look active? Or where does it sort of land?
It's kind of landing in somewhere in between. It's not going to be sunny and dry the whole time. Tuesday looks really nice. Get a nice south wind in here, might get temperatures up to 50 degrees or better. But then a little cold front's going to come through on Wednesday. And I think that's the system that they were originally latching onto as developing it off the coast. But that isn't really going to happen at all. It's just going to come in, bring a little bit of colder air. Initially, it was looking like the lake effect might really crank up behind it. Models are starting to back off on that now as well. So, if I had to take a stab a week out, Thanksgiving Day, probably be chilly, maybe some flurries, a couple squalls around, but it doesn't look like anything too bad right now.
So I guess my last question for you before we get you out of here, biggest surprise forecasting in 2017. What was the biggest surprise that sort of hit you and you're like, oh, didn't see that coming?
I would have to say the way the summer evolved. We started out, constant rain every day, dealing with flash flooding every day. Then we get to the end of July, it's like a switch flipped, and all of a sudden it's bone dry. And by the time we get to late September, October, we're talking about a drought. Thankfully, that got wiped out by the recent heavy rain. But especially that August and September, it was just kind of weird how dry it was, how hot it was, how long that heat lasted into September. That was pretty surprising to me.
How do you identify when those sort of periods will develop? Or is it just kind of like, oh, it's here we are now, it's going to be dry for a while? Is that something that can actually be sort of seen in the long term?
You can kind of get a general sense. You can't really tell very much specifically after even a week or so. You can get some general trends, especially when you start looking at the model ensembles. So they take the model, they adjust something a little bit, and they run it, and they do that like 50 times, and that gives you a nice broad range of possibilities. So you can kind of start to get a sense for what the pattern might evolve like in 2-3 weeks. Honestly, I don't pay too much attention beyond that, though, because I just haven't found it to be too reliable. And really the only thing you're going to be able to tell is, it looks like it might be warmer than average, maybe a little drier than average. But you get one good storm that develops in an otherwise dry, quiet time period, and that can set your rainfall to pretty much normal anyways. So it really is going to come down to the day-to-day weather and whether the storms come here or just miss us.
I know it seems like every news network, local news network I watch, it seems like in October and November, they'll start talking about, they'll start trying to predict what the whole winter is going to look like, what the whole, whether it's snowfall total or whatever the case may be. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that come from you. I'm curious what your take is on that sort of prediction that happens, where it's like they aren't forecasting anything, but they're just kind of saying, this is our educated guess.
Well, I did try it 2 years ago. I did a whole bunch of research and dove into how the summer went and what previous years that were similar to that ended up, and I looked at the long-range models and what sort of patterns might develop, and a lot of the other places were saying either a normal winter or kind of a warm, dry winter. I'm like, no, it's going to be cold and snowy, and it wasn't at all. So I totally didn't succeed with that attempt at forecasting. I haven't tried one of those seasonal forecasts again since. There is a value to them to certain niche industries, the energy industry, the road crews and transportation, they do need that kind of information, as best as they can get it. For the general public, I think it's starting to kind of tread that line with a little bit of hype. People do want to know what the winter is. They're curious. A lot of people either love or really hate the winter, so they want to know what to expect as soon as they can. So people are always asking me, and I was like, I don't really do that. So I know a lot of people this year are saying kind of the trend has been for a warmer, wetter winter. And I know a lot of the reasoning is that it's going to be a La Nina year. I'm not too sure about that. La Nina doesn't tend to have a real strong influence on our winter, unlike El Nino does. It definitely can, but there's other things that can have a bigger impact, circulations in the northern Pacific Ocean or even in the Atlantic Ocean. So we'll have to see how this winter goes and if those forecasts end up being right. And
just quickly before we get you out of here, where can people find you? Where can people find that forecast?
Yep, they can go to flxweather.com. I'm also on Facebook, Finger Lakes Weather, Twitter, FLX_weather. Those are kind of the main three spots that I post stuff.
All right, well, I really appreciate you coming in, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you throughout the winter. I know whenever there's a storm coming, we always call you and try to get your input because there's really nobody who's doing it better in the Finger Lakes, so thanks for the service.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me up, Josh.
Well, that's going to do it for us today. I'd like to thank Drew, our listeners, and, of course, FingerLakes1.com for making this podcast possible. Inside the FLX airs Sundays at 7 p.m. on Spectrum Channel 12 and is available on iTunes, Stitcher, and the FingerLakes1.com app. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next week.